In this section, we will continue to learn about the different properties of real numbers. First, let's review some definitions. The opposite or additive inverse of any number a is negative a. So the additive inverse of 5 is negative 5. The additive inverse of negative 7 would be negative times negative 7, which gives you positive 7. So essentially we're changing the sign. The additive identity is the sum of any number and its opposite is equal to 0. So the additive identity of 5 would be negative 5. Because if we did 5 plus negative 5, it would equal 0. The additive identity of negative 7 would be positive 7. Because negative 7 plus 7 would equal 0. The reciprocal or multiplicative inverse of any non-zero number a is 1 over a. So essentially we're flipping the number. So the multiplicative inverse of 2 over 3 would be 3 over 2. The multiplicative inverse of 4 is really 4 over 1, which would become 1 over 4. The multiplicative inverse of 1 over 5 becomes 5 over 1, which equals 5. The product of a number and its reciprocal is 1, giving us the multiplicative identity. So if we multiply 2 over 3 by 3 over 2, it'll give us 6 over 6, which equals 1. If we multiply 4 over 1 times 1 over 4, it'll give you 4 over 4, which equals 1. And if we multiply 1 over 5 by 5 over 1, it'll also give you 5 over 5, which equals 1. So when you multiply a number by the multiplicative inverse, it always comes back out to 1. Now let's talk about some of the properties of real numbers. The first property is called the closure property. In the closure property, for addition, it tells you that a plus b is a real number. So your example is that 3 plus 4 equals 7. The multiplication property says that a times b is a real number. So for the example, we say that 3 times 4 equals 12. The next property is the commutative property. In the commutative property, it says that a plus b equals b plus a. So for example, we could say that 3 plus 4 equals 4 plus 3, because if we completed both these examples, we get that 7 equals 7. For multiplication, it says that a times b equals b times a, because in the example, 3 times 4 equals 4 times 3. Because we know if we multiply these, 3 times 4 equals 12, and 4 times 3 also equals 12. Now, a way to help you remember this is given below. We can think of the commutative property as like you're commuting. It says below, it says think of the elements as commuting from one location to the other. They get in their cars and drive to new locations. This explanation will help you remember that they are moving or changing places. Because if you think about it, your path from school, your house to school, and school to your house is the same. You're just changing the order. You're changing the order of your commute. So you want to fill in that you think of this as commuting to your job or commuting to school. The next property is the associative property. The associative property says that parentheses a plus b plus c equals a plus b plus parentheses b plus c. And if we were to look at the example below, if we complete the operation, 3 plus 4 equals 7. So we get 7 plus 5, which gives us 12. And on the other side, 4 plus 5 gives you 9, and 3 plus 9 is 12. So since these are the same, this property holds up. For the multiplication example, it says that parentheses a times b times c equals a times parentheses b times c. And in the example we have below, if we use the order of operations, 3 times 4 gives you 12 times 5, And if you multiply 12 times 5, it would give you 60. Now for the other part, 4 times 5 gives you 20, and 3 times 20 is 60. So again, the property holds up. Now, if we look at the example below, to help you remember it, it says that the associative property can be thought of as illustrating friendships or associations. The parentheses show the grouping of two friends. In the example below, the red girl decides that she doesn't want to change from her blue boyfriend to the green boyfriend, so she doesn't want to associate with them anymore. Notice that the elements do not physically move but change the person who they are associating with. So if you want to think of associative property, you can think of it as not wanting to be friends or associate anymore. So you're changing who you're relating to. The next property is the identity property. The identity property of addition says that a plus 0 equals a. And the example is that 3 plus 0 equals 3. Because if we simplify this, 3 plus 0 equals 3. So you get that 3 equals 3. For the multiplication property, it says that a times 1 equals a. So 3 times 1 equals 3. And if we simplify this, 3 times 1 equals 3, so 3 equals 3. Notice that in both these examples, the number is staying the same. It's keeping its identity. Now, to help you remember this, we have what is given to us below. You want to think of it as keeping your identity. Try to remember that I is the most important part of the word. Variables can oftentimes have a meaning, and you want to remember that I am the most important. I am the thing that wants to change. In both cases, that x, or whatever that number is what is staying the same. So think, I am the most important. I don't want to change. In the next example, for the inverse property of addition, a plus negative a equals 0. So the example is 3 plus negative 3 equals 0. And if we simplify this, 3 plus negative 3 is 0, which equals 0. For the inverse property of a multiplication, a times 1 over a equals 1. So 3 times 1 over 3 equals 1. If we think about that, 3 times 1 over 3 gives you 3 over 3, which equals 1. Now, to help you remember these relationships, we think of inventing the inverse. You want to create the element that will get rid of it. Make it 0, make it 1, get rid of that original number. So you want to think of this as inventing the inverse. The last property we have is what's called the distributive property. With the distributive property, you're multiplying the number outside into the two numbers inside. So if we have our example, 3 over 4, 3 parentheses, 4 plus 5, you want to think of it as you're multiplying the 3 into the 4 and the 5. Now, if we do this out separately over here, it will become 3 times 4 plus 5, which is 9. So it would give you 27. If we simplify the other half of this, 3 times 4 gives you 12, and 3 times 5 gives you 15. And 12 plus 15, which will give you 27, showing that these properties maintain. Now, to help you remember this, the distributive property is thought of as you're looking into distribute. You're looking into the parentheses to distribute to both the numbers, or include yourself in both of the numbers. Now, each of these types of examples asks you to identify which property it illustrates. You're not actually solving, you're not completing any calculations, you're just identifying which property is the most similar to. For A, it says negative 2/3 times negative 3/2 equals 1. Since we're getting rid of the number, this is the inverse. So it's the inverse property of, and since we're multiplying here, it's the inverse property of multiplication. For the next one, we're changing the parentheses, you're moving where they're located. Since you're moving the parentheses, you're changing how the numbers are associated. It's the associative property of, and since it's multiplying here, it's the associative property of multiplication. For the next example, the 3 is being moved into the G and the H from here to here. This is what's called the distributive property because you're multiplying it in. Next example says explain why a plus 3 plus negative a equals 3. Now if we changed our numbers and moved them around, this 3 plus a plus 3 plus negative a, we could use the commutative property to make it a plus negative a plus 3, and we could use the associative property to make it a plus negative a plus 3, and the a plus negative a would cancel out, making this really just 3. This is definitely a harder and more challenging question of this type. For 5 plus negative 5, since we're getting rid of the number, this is called the inverse property. And since we're adding, it's the inverse property of addition. For the next number, we're changing how the numbers are associated with the parentheses. So it's this associative property of, and because we're multiplying, it's of multiplication. And you have to make sure you're including that of addition of multiplication. In the last example, it says there are grouping symbols in the equation parentheses 5 plus w plus 8 equals parentheses w plus 5 plus 8, but does not illustrate the associative property of addition. Explain. It doesn't indicate the associative property because the parentheses don't move. This is really the commutative property because we're changing the order of the numbers.